Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin Daf Lamed Tet. It's the daf for Shabbat. Today's daf is sponsored by Gita and David Neufeld in loving memory of Gita's father, Yosef ben Menachem Mendel V'Pesha, Alav Shalom. Tati was so proud of our learning, be it secular or Jewish. He always told us how he envied our Jewish education, which the Nazis and communists managed to deprive him of. Unbelievably, he left Cheder and formal Jewish education when he started learning Mishnah. Yet his dedication to learning and striving with a nightly chavruta, despite a working 12-hour day, and a never-missed weekly shiur and shul molded 3 generations of learners and strivers. Special zchut this year to learn the Daf in Lejeunesse, where he had his last formal Jewish learning experience. Yehi zichro baruch. Okay, we're going to get started with Daf Lamed Tet. So, quick review. We saw yesterday, Rabba Bar Rav said, "Hamakdish avdo yatzal chirut." If somebody says, "I am right, my eved, my slave is sanctified," what he really meant is, according to Rav, I'm setting him free. So at the bottom of the daf, we're going to start with another question on this opinion. Tashma, hamakdish avdo oseh ochel, shelo hikdish ela damav. When somebody sanctifies his slave, oseh ochel, the slave continues to work and can eat the produce of what he does. Okay, or anyone can eat it because it's not sanctified. Because only his value is sanctified, but not things that he produces. So now they want to say that this braita creates a problem. Why does it create a problem? Because this shows that when you sanctify a slave, you sanctify his value. And Rabbah said in the name of Rav that no, you don't sanctify his value. If you recall, there's 3 options of what could happen. Either what you meant is I'm sanctifying his body, which you definitely can't do because there's no such thing. You only sanctify someone's body or something's body if it's an animal that's going to be sanctified for the altar, or it's an item that's going to be used to build the temple. A slave can be neither. So it's not that. The second option is it could be the value of. But we said if it's the value of, then you would have said the value of. Now this source actually seems to say it is the value of. The third option is, since you didn't mean that, and if we assume you didn't mean the second either, because you would have said his value, and you didn't say that, then the only other alternative is to say what you really meant is he's joining the Jewish people. Sanctity as in the Jewish people sanctity. So right now, this seems to go against Rav, to which the Gemara answers, Hamane Rabbi Meir. This source is Rabbi Meir, who disagrees with the rabbis about a different issue, which is the Amal, Ein Adam Motzi Dvarav Levatala. Rabbi Meir says a person doesn't say something if they don't really mean to say something. What does this mean? Well, the sugya comes up. It says in Rashi here, quotes a braita from Erechin, that if somebody gives the sanctity of someone who's less than a month old, there is no value. You say, Erech ploni alai. Okay, the value of this person is on me, which means that you're supposed to give the value designated by the Torah. But there is no value designated by the Torah. So did you mean nothing? Or did you mean the value of this animal, meaning demei instead of erech? You use the word erech, but you must have meant demei. So Rabbi Meir says that you would never have said this if you didn't mean anything. So you must mean the value of. So that's because a person doesn't say something unnecessary. So now we're going to say that source, don't worry about that source. That's not going with Rav, because Rav holds like the rabbis who said people would say something without really meaning it. So let's understand first according to Rabbi Meir, and then we'll see what the rabbis say. So Rabbi Meir says, since people wouldn't say something without really meaning it, since you said, Makdish, I'm sanctifying, you must have meant sanctity and not joining the Jewish people, but you must have meant something that has to do with sanctity. And since it must have to do with sanctity, it must mean you meant the value. Even though you're right, you probably should have chosen the value, but you didn't say that, so we're going to assume you mean something else. Just like we could switch erech with demei, right? Because erech has a particular meaning connected with the Torah, but there is no such erech for an under 30-day-old baby, so we're going to move it to demei. Likewise, here we're going to move it to demei. And when the Gemara asked the question, they were suggesting that maybe it goes by the rabbis. And the rabbis who normally say you wouldn't say something, you might actually say something that's not really necessary. You might make a statement that doesn't mean anything, which could mean that the rabbis you would have thought would have fit in with Rav, but in fact here they say this means value. This means because it doesn't mean, in other words, again, this is kind of like process of elimination. It can't mean the body of. So maybe the rabbis are the ones who say it means the value of. But then the Gemara, and then that would be a question on Rav, because then Rav has nobody to hold on. But in the end, they say, no, it's Rabbi Meir. It's not the rabbis. How do we know it's not the rabbis? And then again, Rabbah, in the name of Rav, who said, Makdish avdo, goes free, if you sanctify your slave, that could fit with the rabbis, and then we have no problem. So now they're going to prove, how do we know for sure that this fits with Rabbi Meir? Because theoretically, what I forgot to mention is, there's two possible reasons why you could say here, and this is the braita, that it really means the value of, because you could either say, like Rabbi Meir, which is, you're not going to say something unnecessary, which means dmei, right? When you say makdish, I'm sanctifying, you really meant for its value, for his value, even though you didn't say the word dmei. The alternative is that what you meant is, just like if you say I'm sanctifying a non-kosher animal, well, the non-kosher animal can't go on the altar, so it must be for value. What you really meant is, I'm sanctifying this so I could sell it and use it for some, right, and buy something that could be used for the temple. So maybe what you meant was, even if you could maybe say something unnecessary, you still might say that when I say I'm sanctifying this eved, the slave, what you really meant is, I'm going to sell the slave and bring its value to the temple. And maybe that's why the braita said Ledame works, which would then again go against what Rav said, which is he actually goes free, because what he really meant is he's going to be a Jew. So again, I want to make it clear. There's two possibilities about why it would be value. Either because you're not going to unnecessarily say things that don't make any sense, so sanctifying must mean for its value, or it's because what you meant is, I mean to sell this and use the value of what I sold the slave for in the slave market. Well, now the Gemara is going to prove, and then that would have matched to the rabbis, and that would have raised the question on Rav. But now the Gemara is going to prove that it's clearly Rabbi Meir and it's not the rabbis, in which case we've resolved our question, which is what we just did. But now the Gemara is going to further prove that it's Rabbi Meir, and it's not because you meant I was going to sell this in the shuk, this slave. So likely this is Rabbi Meir who says it's only because we assume you're not wasting your words. And how do we know this? To katane seifa, it says in the second part of this source, v'chein hu sheikdish atzmo osev ochel. Same thing if you sanctify your own self. If I say I am sanctified, what did I mean? I clearly didn't mean I'm putting myself on the altar. I also couldn't have meant what we just suggested a minute ago, which is I'm going to sell myself in the slave market and take the value, because I'm not a slave. I don't get sold in the slave market. I'm not like an animal that can be sold. I'm not like a slave that can be sold. I can't sell myself. So therefore, it can't be the option we just suggested. So if that braita starts off with sanctifying your slave and then moves to sanctifying yourself, and they're both the same law, which is hikdish atzmo osev ochel, you can work, you can use the produce you create, it's not sanctified, shelo hikdish ela damav, because just like the slave, I only sanctified myself for my value, which means, again, that what would I do? I would come up with what my value is, and then I would bring it to the temple. So again, this fits with Rabbi Meir, that really I should have said my value. I didn't, but since I don't say things unnecessarily, it must be what I meant. We have nothing else that would really make sense, and that would be Rabbi Meir. So again, let's read this inside. Rabbi Meir, who he Shapir. If this fits with if you say it's Rabbi Meir, it fits perfectly, because it's the same logic for a slave and for a person. But Rabbanan an eved can be sold for its value, but but a person isn't normally sold for his value. So therefore, it must mean the reason is not because I meant I'll sell it for its value, but because we hold like Rabbi Meir that generally people don't say things if they really didn't mean it, and something from it. So again, I wouldn't use the language of sanctify if I didn't mean I was actually sanctifying something, which means the only way I can sanctify a slave is by his value. Lema Gittin. Now we've brought up this issue of what's the status of someone who sanctifies his slave. We saw Rabbi Meir, who said that it would be the value of the slave. We saw Rav, who Rabba quoted, saying the person goes free. So Lema Gittin, why don't we suggest that this is actually a debate among Tanaim? How so? Hamakdish avdo en mo'alimbo. If you sanctify your slave, there's no laws of me'ila. What is me'ila? Misuse of consecrated property. There's no prohibition of me'ila, of accidentally misusing the slave, because there's no sanctity, because we just said that's Rav. He just goes free. He's not sanctified. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Mo'alim b'sa'aro. Rabban Shimon Gamliel says you're liable for me'ila misuse of consecrated property if you use his hair. Now, why specifically hair? We don't know yet. We're going to get back to this. But right now, we're just assuming it sounds like, my la b'hakamiflage. Is this not the root of the debate? Demar savar kadosh, umar savar lo kadosh. One says it's sanctified. The other one says it's not sanctified. If it's sanctified, there's laws of me'ilah. If it's not sanctified, there's no laws of me'ilah. To which the Gemara says, v'tizbara, do you really think that's the case? If it was the case that one says he's sanctified and the other says he's not sanctified because we really meant just to free him, well, haimo alimbo, efeimo alimbo, the language doesn't make sense. Why would it say there's laws of me'ilah? There aren't laws of me'ilah. Hai kadosh ve'eno kadosh me'baile. It should have just simply said he is sanctified or he's not sanctified. Ella, so therefore that can't be the root of the debate, and we reject the suggestion. So now we have to understand, since we already brought this up, what is the root of the debate? Ela dekule ama kadosh. Everybody agrees that he's sanctified. The question is just, ela b'hakamiflage, haka. The root of their machloket, and it's clear they would all say, like Rabbi Meir, he is sanctified for his value. What's the root of the debate, though? Why is there a question? Is there me'ilah in his hair? Is there not me'ilah in his hair? Or just me'ilah in general? Demar saval avda kimakarke edame, umar saval kimataltale edame. So one holds a slave. This is a debate that comes up in many different situations. In what category does a slave go? Is a slave considered like land? Now, there's no laws of misuse of consecrated property when it comes to land. There's only me'ilah. You're only going to be liable for misuse of consecrated property if it's movable possessions, metaltalin. So therefore, if you view a slave as land, then you're going to say there's no laws of me'ilah. And that's the first opinion. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Mo'alim b'sa'aro, because you can be liable for me'ilah if you use the hair, because it's metaltalin. A slave is like movable property. To which the Gemara says, still, and we haven't gotten to this issue yet, but now we're raising the issue. Why is it specifically his hair? The machloket should be about his body, any part of his body. Why are we talking? We're talking about the slave himself. It should be any part of the body. There should be laws of me'ilah. To which the Gemara says, so fine, reject that answer. So we have one possibility that this was all about, is he sanctified, not sanctified, which was the same as the debate we've been discussing. Second option is a slave like land, or is it like movable property? Also, that was rejected. So now we say, dekule alma avdik makarke dam. Really, everybody thinks a slave is like land. The debate is hair that's about to be cut off, meaning if I'm going to cut off my hair, yes, the slave, the body, and every part of the slave is really like land. So there's no laws of misuse of consecrated property. But since the hair is going to be cut off, do we view the hair as if it's already cut off and separate from the body, and then it would be movable, and then there would be laws of me'ilah, or not? So Mar Savar Kigazuz Dami. One says we view it as if it's cut off, and therefore that's Rabbi Shimon Gamliel who says there are laws of me'ilah by his hair. Mar Savar Lav Kigazuz Dami, and the other one holds it's not like as if it's cut off, and there you have your debate. And that was the third possible explanation, which actually makes the most sense. All the others were rejected. Now that we already talked about this debate about something that's going to be cut off, is it like it's already detached? So we're going to say, Lema Hane Tanai Kahane Tanai. Seems like this machloket between Rabbanit Michelle Farber and the Tanakama is just like a machloket that appears somewhere else. Ditnan, Rabbi Meir Omer. Yesh dvarim shehem kikarka ve'enam kikarka. There's some things that are like land, but they're not like land, meaning they're attached to the ground, but they're not treated as if they're attached to the ground. Ve'en chachamim modim lo, but the rabbis don't agree with him about this. Tetzad, what would be the case? Now, before you get here, you have to know there's something called modeh b'miktzat. If I admit to a partial claim, okay, you claim I owe you money, and I say claim I owe you $100, and I say I only owe you 50. So I'm modeh b'miktzat. I admit that I owe you 50, but I don't admit that I owe you the other 50. So in order to get out of paying the other 50, I have to swear, take an oath. But that's only relating to money and movables, but not land. There is no modeh b'miktzat shvua by land. So what is land? Things attached to the ground. So if there's a case of eser kpanim tu'unot, masarti lecha. You say, I gave you 10 vines. V'hala omer, eno ela chamesh. And they were, tu'unot means they were full of grapes. And I said, what are you talking about? You only gave me 5. Rabbi Meir mechayev. Rabbi Meir says, you have to swear. You have to take an oath on the other 5. The chachamim omrim, kol hamechubar lakarka, Anything attached to the ground is attached to the ground. It's like, right? Anything attached to the ground is like land. So if you don't take a shvuat moda b'miktzat on land, you don't take a shvuat moda b'miktzat on these grapes that are the vines with the grapes that are attached to the ground. The Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. He explains, Anavim ha'omdim libatzel ika benai. The machloket they're having is really about grapes that are about to be cut, that are ready to be cut. They're ripe and ready to go. To Rabbi Meir Sabal kibitzurot amyan. Rabbi Meir says they're already as if they're cut, and that's why you have to take a shvuat moda b'miktzat. Because even though they're attached to the ground, since they're ready and ripe and ready to be cut, they're already like they're detached. And that's why there's a shvuat moda b'miktzat. But Rabbanit moda b'miktzat again means admitted to part of it. Okay, and that's an oath, a shvuah, an oath for admitting part of it. Rabbanan savre lav kibitzurot amyan. The rabbis say no, it's not like they're attached to the ground, detached from the ground, because they're still attached. So what if you're going to pick them, but you're going to cut them soon, but you didn't yet? So which the Gemara says, look, it's the exact same debate. Something that's about to be cut, is it viewed as if it's cut and detached or not? To which the Gemara says, no, it's not the same machloket. So we tried earlier to say, maybe this machloket right before this, we brought a suggestion that maybe the machloket Rav and Rabbi Meir is based on a machloket Tanaim, and we rejected that. And once we brought that machloket Tanaim, we're now saying maybe that machloket Tanaim is the exact same one. There's in a different place, and now we're saying no, it's not either. Why is that? Because afilu tema Rabbi Meir, you could explain Rabbi Meir like this: Ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Meir hatam ela ba'anavim. Maybe he only says the grapes we view as if they're detached, but not hair. Why is that? When the grapes are ripe, if you leave them on the vine, they'll actually start rotting soon, and they won't be good anymore, right? If you have fruit you don't pick on time, eventually they rot even attached. But hair, the more you leave it on, it's actually better for it. So therefore, the hair could be viewed more as connected to the body, because it's better for it to stay attached to the body, right? Once you cut the hair dries out, it's no good anymore. Whereas the grapes will actually be protected better once you cut them, because they're going to start getting rotten if you leave them on the vine. So again, quick review. We started with this source that seemed to contradict Rav. We explained it away by saying it follows a minority opinion of Rabbi Meir. We tried to suggest the machloket, those two different approaches could be found in a machloket Tanaim. We rejected that, but then we said maybe that machloket Tanaim is like a different tannaitic debate, and then we rejected it. Kisalik Rav Chia bar Yosef. When Rav Chia bar Yosef went down, he said, Amar lahashmata derive kamei Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, actually Kisalik is, sorry, he went up. Sorry, my mistake. When Rav Chia bar Yosef went up to Israel, he brought the limud of Rav in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, if you remember, there were two versions. There was a version that he said, Hamafkir abdo yatsa lechirut. I'm sorry, Hamakdish abdo yatsa lechirut. And then there was one that said, and that you also need to get shichur. So we have two options. Actually, my mistake. We're now moving to the mafkir avdo, not the makdish avdo. If you make your slave, you release your slave. Okay, mafkir avdo, that's Rav Yosef. Mafkir avdo yatsa lechirut. And then we have Rav Chia bar Avin in the name of Rav, who said not only yatsa lechirut is he free when you're mafkir, but he also needs to get shichur. You're going to have to, right? You have to deal with two things. Number one, the monetary aspect, that he's free and he can own himself, but also can he go get remarried, right? For that, he needs to get shichur. He needs an emancipation document. So it's not clear exactly what version he said here, whether you also need to get shichur or not, but we're going to see the sugya like this. So Rabbi Chia bar Yosef said this shmata, this limud of Rav in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar le, Rabbi Yochanan's reaction was, Amar Rav Hachi? Did Rav really say that? To which the Gemara says, V'hu lo Amar Hachi. What was Rabbi Yochanan so surprised about? Did he not hold the same thing? V'hamar Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Didn't Ula say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Hamafkir avdo yatsa lechirut v'tzarich get shichur. If you make your slave ownerless, you say you're hefker, you're ownerless, he goes free and he needs an emancipation document. So how could Rabbi Yochanan be so surprised by what he said? To which the Gemara answers, Hachika Amarle. This is what Rabbi Yochanan said. It was a misinterpretation. What he said was, Amarav Kavate. It wasn't Did Rav really say this? It was, oh, Rav says just like me. Because here this rabbi came and brought him the Torah of Rav and said, oh, that's so nice to hear that Rav says the exact same thing as me. And then probably the version he heard was the second version, which is he releases him and needs to get shichur, right? In other words, he makes him ownerless, then he's already on his own, but he needs to get shichur also. Now we have a different version. Some people say lo siyamu hakame. He didn't actually finish the whole statement. And all he heard was that Rav says he's free. So Amar le, v'lo amar Rav tzarich get shichur. Rabbi Yochanan's response was, but doesn't Rav hold that he needs an emancipation document to free him entirely? For Rabbi Yochanan l'tanei. And actually Rabbi Yochanan then fits perfectly in with what Rabbi Yochanan generally says. Da Amar ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan hamafkir avdo yatsa l'cheruv tzarich get shichur. And then he said, but this goes perfectly with what Rabbi Yochanan said, because Rabbi Yochanan said you actually need this release, this document of emancipation. Gufa. Now we're going to start with going more in depth into the statement of Ula. Amar Ula. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Ula. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Ula said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Hamafkir avdo yatsa l'cheruv. So that's just a quote of what we just saw. V'tzarich get shichur. Okay, so this statement was said by Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Again, someone makes their slave ownerless. He needs, number one, he immediately becomes free, and he needs to get shichur though in order to be able to marry. Because remember, a slave, a Canaanite slave, can only marry when they're a slave, a Canaanite slave woman. But when they're freed, they can marry a Jewish woman, right? And if they're at an in-between stage, they're stuck. They really can't marry anybody. So that's what the get shichur resolves that issue to permit them to marry. Rabbi Abba Ula. Rabbi Abba brings a question on Ula now, and he says the following. If a convert dies, now a convert has no one to inherit from his property. A convert is like a katan shenolad, so all his relatives aren't his relatives. So if he dies and doesn't have relatives, right, because he was a convert, everybody basically, all of his stuff becomes ownerless, and people come and bazazu, they took all his stuff basically. Well, hayubahen avadim, if there were slaves among his possessions, Canaanite slaves, ben gedolim u ben ktanim, kanu atzman b'nei cholim, whether they're young or whether they're old, they, or of age, they acquire themselves, meaning what happens? He dies, they immediately become ownerless. As soon as they're ownerless, they kind of acquire themselves, and then they're free. Okay, like immediately, it just kind of kicks in. As soon as everything is ownerless, so people could come take their possessions, but not their slaves, because their slaves acquire themselves, and then they're free people. So they immediately get freed upon his death. To which the braita explains that Abba Shaul disagrees. We're going to deal a lot with Abba Shaul in the second part of today's stuff. And I agree with you about the older ones, but but when it comes to the young people, what's the problem? A young person doesn't have an ability to acquire anything. So they can't acquire themselves. They become ownerless, and then someone else can acquire them because they can't acquire themselves. Right? According to Tanakama, you have to really wonder why Tanakama thinks so. Probably Tanakama thinks so because they just kind of revert back to being a free person. But according to Abba Shaul, they have to actually do an act of acquiring. Now, even if they don't actually do any act, they just by default kind of acquire themselves. But if you can't acquire anything because you're too young, you're a minor, well, then it's not going to work. So he distinguishes between older and younger, younger being right, under bar mitzvah age, not being able to acquire. So now they continue. The chi. So now this was all the question. What's the question? So let's try to remember where we were. Ula said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, but this is the complicated part of today's stuff. So Habafkir Avdo Yatsa L'Chevut and needs to get shichur. According to this, when the ger dies, they're free, and they're entirely free, and they acquire themselves, and there's no need for a get shichur. Even Abba Shaul, who disagrees with Tanakama, at least about a gadol, he acquires himself. So, v'chim mikatav get shichur le'elu. Now, who wrote an emancipation document for these slaves? Nobody. So how does that work? Amal damehai midrabanan de kalo gamre inashe shmata. So Ula says, it seems like you really don't know at all what you're talking about. He talks about him as the third person. It's kind of not embarrass him so much, but it looks like this rabbi has no idea what he's talking about, or hasn't learned properly. Because what? Tamamai Amara Nachman Kasavar Ula Abdo Degil Ki Ishta. What's the reason for all this? So Rav Nachman explains that Ula holds that Avdo Degil is like his wife. Okay, what does that mean? The slave is like a woman. In what sense? Ma ishto mishtacha below get. When a husband dies, does a woman need a get? No. Husband dies, the woman's free. Likewise, af avadav mishtachim below get. In other words, when do you need a get shichur? When you're freeing someone, when you're still alive. But if you die, there's no get shichur because you died. And then it's just like a woman. She goes free. They automatically go free at their death. So now comes the following interesting argument. This isn't actually the super complicated part. It's going to get a little more complicated further down. But like really dealing with Abba Shal, which we're going to get to soon. But now we basically say the following. So, but ihachi, if so, afili Yisrael nami, then what does it mean? Why difference between a ger and a regular Jew? If the point is a slave is like a woman, the husband dies, she's free. A slave, the owner dies, they're free. Should be whether the owner's a Jew or the owner's a born Jew or a Jew who converted. What's the difference? To which they answer, Amar Kra, difference between a convert and a Jew is that a born Jew is that a born Jew has laws of inheritance they pass on to their children. But a convert doesn't have, right? We're talking about a convert who converted with their family, meaning they all converted, and then they're each considered like individuals. So there's no laws of inheritance. So they don't get to pass on by inheritance. So because they don't pass on as inheritance, these slaves go free, and then they're like a woman, and they don't need a get shichur. But if they're Jewish, born Jewish, as opposed to became Jewish through conversion, if they're born Jewish, then their slaves automatically go by inheritance to their children. So therefore, what are we going to have here? Well, that explains the convert issue, and that explains why there's no need for a get shichur here, even though in normal cases there is. Still have one more question. If the whole thing is if you neutralize and there's no issue of inheritance, a case where there is no inheritance, then basically the slave will go free immediately, won't need to get shichur. Well, then we have a problem. Because what? Someone who's mafkir avdo, let's say a person makes their slave ownerless in his lifetime and then dies. Now, he didn't give him a get shichur yet. And then he dies. So now what would you say? Would you need a get shichur? Well, he needed it earlier when he made him ownerless. But at this point that he didn't do it and the guy died, since there's no one to pass on the slave to, because from a financial perspective, he doesn't own the slave anymore. Therefore, the slave should automatically go free and doesn't need a get shichur, because as soon as we neutralize the inheritance issue, and in this case, he's not going to pass it on by inheritance because it's not owned by him anymore. So you also shouldn't need to get shichur. And alama amar hamemar, but why did hamemar say hamafkir avdova met otoa eved ein lo takana? This slave can never get remarried because there's no one now to give him a get shichur because he's not owned and he didn't pass him on inheritance. So nobody owns him anymore, but he has nobody, right? And he has no one to give him a get shichur, but he needs a get shichur. But he shouldn't need a get shichur according to what we just said, to which the Gemara says, Damemar kasha. Actually, what Hamemar said is actually difficult and doesn't really make so much sense. Okay, now moving on to the next part of our daf. This is the part that gets a little bit complicated, what we're going to do here. And I say complicated, usually Gemaras are complicated when it's hard to understand what the pshat reading is, and there's multiple interpretations among the Rishonim because the simple reading is complicated and hard to figure out exactly what the right reading is. Okay, we don't really know what the right reading is, and that's our job to try to figure out. I'm going to go with one interpretation, but know that it's a little bit tricky here. So if there's things that you don't 100% understand, it's because they're not 100% understandable, because there's difficulties with each commentary, which is why there's multiple interpretations. Starts simple. Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi says in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that we hold like Abba Shaul, who made this distinction between older slaves and younger slaves. Amalei Rabbi Zera le Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi. So now Rabbi Zera says to Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, who said that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said halach is like Abba Shaul. He asked him the following question, turning now to Amud Bet. Beferish shmi'ala? Did you hear this explicitly from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? Oh, michlala shmi'ala. Or did you infer it from something else he said? To which we say, okay, well, why did he ask this question? Michlala, what did he think that maybe something Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said made him think this? And then we're going to say, after we explain that, why Rabbi Zera thought if you're going to infer it from there, maybe you're wrong. And then we'll see whether he actually heard it explicitly from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi or he really learned it from here, in which case, maybe we're not sure he's really right about the fact that maybe Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi didn't really hold like Abba Shal. And then we'll see in the end whether it was beferish or whether it was michlal. To which the Gemara says, so my klala, what is the case where you could have inferred from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi? Da'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, amru lefnei Rabbi. They said before Rabbi, Amar nityaashti miploni avdi mahu. If somebody said, I give up my rights, okay, I've had enough of him, I don't want to have to do with him anymore, what happens? So Amar lahem, omer ani, en lo takana ela b'shtar. This is what we saw before. It's not enough to just release him. He needs a shtar, meaning en lo takana, he can't marry anyone right now until he gets the shtar shichur. Without the shtar shichur, he cannot marry anyone because he's not really a slave, but he's also not really fully free. But I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. So that's what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi was explaining Rabbi. He was quoting Rabbi. Then he quoted Rabbi Yochanan. So we're going to base all we understand from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi on what he quoted from Rabbi, and then he quoted Rabbi Yochanan explaining Rabbi. But I'm a Rabbi Yochanan, my time at derive. Why did Rabbi say that he has no way to be released unless he has to be permitted to marry someone unless he has this document? Gamar la mi isha. He darshans out la by a slave and la by the woman in the get. We've seen that la lishma. Remember, it says v'katav la, and he says gzera shava. Now, before we get to the gzera shava, I want to show you the pasuk. We're going to get to this pasuk later today as well. It's a pasuk about a shivcha charufa. Shivcha charufa, there's actually some different interpretations of this as well, but I'll explain it in the following way. It says in Vayikra Yutet, pasuk kaf, ish ki ishkavet isha shekvatzera, if a man sleeps with a woman, v'hi shivcha nechrepet leish. She's a slave woman. We're talking about a Canaanite slave woman who is designated to a man. What kind of a man? Well, an Evet Ivri, a Jewish slave, is allowed to be with a shivcha or a Jewish woman. He can actually be with one or the other. And she was kind of designated to him. The issue is that when you're a Jewish slave and you're designated, it's kind of like you do kiddushin or something like that with this slave woman. You're actually not married, betrothed properly. You're not. It's not a real kiddushin, but you're allowed to be with him. Now, if you were with a man who, this slave woman, who was already designated to this man, and she wasn't freed. In other words, she theoretically could have been freed and become Jewish, but she wasn't freed, not by pidyon, by redemption, which would mean money, or she didn't have a document that freed her. Okay, this wasn't a good thing, but you won't die from this. Because she wasn't fully freed. She didn't get this shtar to free her up. So now, the word la appears in the pasuk, okay, where it said, chufasha lo nitan la, okay, because she wasn't given this shtar. So now we're going to say the following. Ma isha b'shtal, we're going to learn the gzera shava between the two. Just like a woman gets released and is permitted to marry another man only with a document, av even nami b'shtar. A slave also needs a document, meaning it's not enough to release him and from his monetary, not being the monetary possession of this man, like Yeush, Hefker, they're all synonymous, but you need a document. So that's what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi quotes Rabbi Yochanan as bringing a source for why Rabbi said you need the shtar. If someone makes you ownerless, it's not enough until you get married. You're not going to be able to get until you get your document, you're not going to be permitted to marry anyone else. Now, here comes what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, what Rabbi Zera is saying. Did you infer from this the following? You must have inferred from here the following. Now we want to get to, let's try to remember, Abba Shaul, who distinguished between Ktanim and Gedolim and said older ones become released, right? But younger ones cannot, they just get picked up by somebody else, whoever acquires them first, because young ones can't be released from the monetary bond. So, Hadayak Tamina ki isha. Ma isha isura velo mamona, av evidnami isura velo mamona. It's like a woman. just like a woman is, the get releases her. Now, what does a get do? It releases her and allows her to marry someone else. It's not a monetary agreement. Now, there are monetary ramifications, but really on a Torah level, the get is just there so she can leave his house. Af Eved Nami is Surah V'lo Mamona. The document of the Eved is specifically for permitting marriage and not a financial agreement, which means what? That the other way releases him from, one second, the shtar, right. The hefker itself dealt with the financial, and the shtar dealt with the marriage. So now, what does this have to do with the katan? So this is the tricky part. Rashi explains, I'm in the middle of the Rashi Kadiyat Tamina. Eved katan lo ayre Rebbe. But Rebbe wasn't talking about, okay, and this is the assumption. Rebbe was distinguishing when they made this connection, which then Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was connecting, right? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi quoted Rabbi Yochanan, who made this connection to explain Rebbe. He wasn't talking about a young Eved. Why? A young slave. Dilav dumia deishahu. He's not like a woman. Because the ika drara de mamona ale. Here, drara de mamona seems to mean there's a financial connection between them. Because he's not fully released because he can't acquire himself. He says the following: the young slave actually doesn't have this problem. When he said "ein lo takana ela b'shtar," he must have only meant an older one, because the younger one remains a slave. Someone else will just pick him up; he'll stay a slave, and therefore he can marry a shifra. So it's really only the older one that has a problem, because the older one can acquire himself. Okay, that's an assumption. Why exactly he makes this jump is not so clear, but we're going to see in a minute that he doesn't really like the fact that they made this assumption. So comes Rabbi Zeir and he says the following. So first the Gemara says, V'i michlala mai. So what's the difference if you say it's michlala? Theoretically, and by the way, we're going to see later that it seemed like they were inferring that a woman is a gadolah, and therefore also the slave is a gadol. Okay, that the woman must be of age, and therefore the slave must be of age as well, which is a weird assumption, and it's exactly what the Gemara is going to contradict in a minute. So now he says, and then that would prove that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who quoted Rebbe, and then quoted Rabbi Yochanan explaining Rebbe, and we're making this comparison between the get and the slave, and it seems to be that it's all talking about an older slave, and it wouldn't work for a younger slave, or it wouldn't be true for a younger slave. The younger slave actually has a resolution. He can just marry a slave woman because he doesn't become his own. Well, the Gemara says, so what's the big deal if he says it's michlala? It sounds like you could infer that. So Amar Le, Rabbi Zeir says to him, well, if you say it's michlala, adraba, I would say the exact opposite. Dok mina li'idach kisa. Infer from here exactly the opposite. Ma'isha ben gdola ben tana. Actually, a woman who needs a divorce document would be even a woman who's a minor. If a woman gets married and is a minor and betrothed, and then she wants to be unbetrothed, or the husband doesn't want to stay married to her, he actually has to give her a divorce document. So af eved nami ben gadol ben katan. This should be, an eved should be just like a woman, even young, which means he actually disagrees with Abba Shaul. So basically what Rabbi Zeir made a whole argument about was, if you learned that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, you assumed from this whole interaction that happened, this whole quote that he quoted, that he says that Ben Gadol, that it's only that we're going to distinguish, and really he holds like Abba Shaul. It's not true. You can't infer that from here. To which the person who quoted, remember who it was Rabbi Yaakov bar Evi, who said, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says this, Amalei beferish shmiali. Oh, by the way, he actually told me explicitly. So it wasn't that I inferred it from here, but he actually said it explicitly, and end of story. So we have this whole complicated sugya, really for no reason, because he didn't actually infer it at all. Now we're going to have a very similar sugya, but in the reverse of what we just did now. It'll be a little easier because we already just read this, and it's like the mirror image of this sugya. Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now pay attention. Before it was Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Now Rabbi Chia bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, "Ein halacha Abba Shaul." The halacha is not like Abba Shaul. To which Amalei Rabbi Zeir, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, beferish shmialach or michlala shmialach. So basically, we're going to come to the exact opposite inference, the exact opposite conclusion about Rabbi Yochanan. he doesn't hold like Abba Shaul, to which the Gemara says, or Rabbi Zera, the same Rabbi Zera asks him. It wasn't the same person who said it, but it was the same Rabbi Zera says, did you learn it b'feir shmialach or michlala shmialach, or did you infer it? My klala, where would you have inferred it from? From this exact thing that we just had, and we're going to quote it again. To Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Amru lifnei Rebbe, they said before Rebbe, Nitya Ashimi Ploni Avdi Ma'u, if you say, I give up on my slave, I'm making him ownerless, what's the case? Amar Lahem, Rebbe answered, Omer Ani, En Lo Takana Lebishtar. Rebbe says, I told them, the only way to fix it is by giving him a document. If he doesn't have that, he can't get remarried. But Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my time of derive, Gamar Lala Mi Isha, Ma Isha Bishtar, If Evid Nami Bishtar, Gang Zera Shava, we're going to learn one from the other. And here comes the difference. And then Kadiyak Mina, and then comes Rabbi Zera and says, well, you can infer from here what? You probably infer from here the following. The exact opposite as last time. Isha, Ma Isha ben Gedola ben Tana, Af Eved Nami ben Gadol ben Katan. You probably inferred, oh, woman, Eved, woman could be old or young. Eved could be old or young, and therefore you held against Abba Shaul that young slaves could also acquire themselves. And then again, you would need the shar in order to get remarried, but you did acquire yourself at that point. And then, so what's the difference if I inferred it? He asks him, Adrabah, because I could say the exact opposite. Rabbi Zera says, Dok mina lahachisa, ma isha isura velo mamona, af eved nami isura velo mamona. Because I would infer the exact opposite, which is just like a woman is isur and not mamon, right? Again, this whole thing where the get releases her, af eved nami isura velo mamona, and it's not used to learn isha ben gedola ben tana, it's learned to teach this other thing. And then you would theoretically say maybe it's the opposite, and he does make this distinction between young and old, and then it wouldn't be able to infer from here that Rabbi Yochanan holds against Abba Shaul. To which he answers him, just like the first person, oh, he actually told me explicitly, so it doesn't really matter if you want to say from this place you might infer the opposite. Well, he told me explicitly that he really holds against Abba Shaul. So we have Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi who holds like Abba Shaul, and we have Rabbi Yochanan who holds against Abba Shaul. Okay. Now we're going to go into something we talked about before. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, we just quoted. Amar lahem, Omer ani. This is Rebbe. This is what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi quoted. Rebbe is saying, Amar lahem, Omer ani, en lo takana ele b'shtar. Now Rebbe said this. On the other hand, this braita that contradicts. V'hatanya Rebbe Omer ani, af hu noten t'mei atzmo v'yotze mipnei shehu kimachoro lo. Now we're talking about a slave who his master sanctified him. Now, let's say the master sanctifies him. Now, if we say his value is sanctified, so what happens? Right now, the treasurer of the temple kind of owns him because his value is to the temple. So what can he do according to Rebbe? Notein demei atzmo. We can go to the treasurer of the temple and say, I'm giving my value and I'm buying myself out of here. I'm owned by hekdesh right now, so I'll pay the temple and I'll be free. It's like he's buying himself from the hekdesh, from the temple. So that seems to indicate that that once he does that, he's free. And he doesn't need anyone to release him with a document, emancipation document. So that seems to contradict Rebbe. To which they answer, Hachi Kamar, o b'kesef, o b'shtar. Really, Rebbe says you can either do it with money or you can do it with a document. But what? Why did he say before the only way to do it is with a shtar? Because in that case, hai pakale kaspe, he already released him. He made him ownerless, which meant there was no way for him to buy himself out because he's buying himself from nobody. So in that case, there was no option for money, and that's ula fuke mehai tana. And this is all against the following Tana who says, that's Rebbe was trying to go against a different Tana because Rebbe really thinks money or shtar. But this braita, Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Mishum Rabbi Akiva, kesef gomer ba kederach shtar gomer ba. You would have thought maybe you can finish it with money or a shtar, and then they're free to marry whoever they want. Talmud Lomar, we're going to go back to that Shifcha Harufa pasuk. Vehefta lo niftata, or kol parsha kula lelo chufasha. Lomar lacha shtar gomer ve'ena kesef gomer. You might have noticed this, you might have not, but the pasuk was describing this woman who is designated to a man. Vehefta lo niftata. By the way, some people say she was half released, and that's why I didn't get into all these details, but that she was like half released, not fully released. Anyway, for a different time. Hefta lo niftata, o chufasha lo nitana. One was money, one was shtar. But then the pasuk ends, lo yumatu ki lo chupasha. He won't get the death penalty for, like this other man who sleeps with her, won't get the death penalty for being with her because she wasn't released. And chupasha means not released, not by money, but by shtar. So this opinion of Rabbi Shimon, quoted in the name of Rabbi Akiva, was to say, because it ends with hupasha, the shtar, we learn from there that shtar is the thing and not money. Okay, it's really shtar that ends it. You just redeem with money, they're not free to marry whoever they want. So now we're going to have a whole discussion. Who do we hold by? Rebbe or Rabbi Shimon? Do you need shtar? Could it be shtar or money? Or does it have to be shtar? Amarami Barchama, Rav Nachman, halacha ke Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yossi Barchama, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha ke Rabbi Ein halacha ke Rabbi Shimon. So we have two different approaches here. Eshkachei Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak l'Rav bar Sheilta. He found this Rav bar Sheilta davakaya pitcha de beit tefila. He was at the shul, and the entrance to the shul. Amar le halacha ein halacha. He said, "Do we hold like him or do we not?" Amar le ani omer ein halacha. The Rabbanan de atu mimachoza amre Amar Rabbi Zera mishmei Rav Nachman halacha. Okay, so I say no, but these other people in Machoza say yes, in the name of Rav Nachman. And v'chi'ata l'sura, and when I got to Surah, eshkachtei l'Rabbi Chia bar Avin, amri la emeli izi gufa du uvda hechiava. So when I got there, I said, I saw Rabbi Chia bar Avin, and they said to him, and I said to him, explain to me how this all went about. Amr li, so he said to me, there was a woman who was owned by a guy who was about to die on his deathbed. She started crying to him, the slave woman. How long are you going to make me a slave for? He took his hat, he threw it at her. Go acquire your freedom with this hat. Okay, this is what you call a kinyan chalipin, where we do like a symbolic, sometimes you just pick up a handkerchief. He threw her the hat and he said, buy your freedom with this. Atu the kamed Rav Nachman, that came before Rav Nachman, Amar lu lo asava lo klum. He said, this is nothing. Here you see what? It didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because he didn't give her a shtar shichbor. So man dechaza savar mishum dalach Rabbi Shimon. So people saw and thought it's because he holds like Rabbi Shimon. But in fact, it's not true. Again, we have a case where people inferred something from a particular situation, like the earlier part of today's talk. It was a different problem. Kinyan chalipin, there's a whole debate. Is it just symbolic? Can we use anyone's object? Or does it have to be the person who's purchasing it has to pass an item to the person who's selling something, right? There has to be like an exchange, like money. In this case, he threw it to her and she was also acquiring. He did it wrong. Because he did it wrong, Rav Nachman didn't accept it. Wrong according to Rav Nachman's approach. So that's why he didn't accept it. Nothing to do with Rabbi Shimon at all. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Chate, Amar Rav Hamnuna Saba, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Ashian, Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, Halacha ki Rabbi Shimon. So another person who passes like Rabbi Shimon, and comes the Gemara and concludes, Belohi ein halacha ki Rabbi Shimon. We actually don't hold like him, and we actually do allow this slave to get remarried based on either buying out by money or a shtar. That's the conclusion of the Gemara. So just to do a very quick review, I know it's very late, it's the Shabbos stuff also, but quick review. So we started with, it's a very complicated daf. We started with the Makdish Avdo. Against Rav, we brought the source, but then we said it's Rabbi Meir, don't worry. We went through the Lema Kitanai, and then let's say that Machloket, I'm not going to go through that. We did that already. Then we started with, we already got into, we talked about when Rav came to Rabbi Yochanan, and right, they brought the Torah of Rav to Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan responded, and it's clear Rabbi Yochanan held, you need a shtar. And then we quoted that in the name of Ula, and then we brought a question on that from the ger that died, and then we distinguished why that's different. And then we brought these two statements of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan about whether we hold like Abba Shaul or not, because we got into Abba Shaul through the Ula thing, right? The question we brought in Ula had this machloket Abba Shaul and the rabbis there a distinction between an older and a younger slave. We went through that. Then we went back to this idea of ein lo takana lebishtar, and then we showed Rebbe contradicted himself, to which we then explained it's either money or shtar. Just in that case, there was no money exchange possible because he was already ownerless. And then we said he disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, and then we had a whole discussion, do we hold like Rabbi Shimon or not? That was a long daf, a complicated daf, but wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Shabbat Tov. And if you go over this daf a second time, you'll see it's much clearer. I had that experience when I was preparing as well. Wishing everyone a great day.